Her work at the YMCA focuses on building service providers' capacity to work with newcomer communities around gender-based violence prevention while understanding their unique experiences, needs, and challenges. She works directly with newcomers through programs and workshops and leadership opportunities to raise awareness of gender-based violence. It is my pleasure to introduce Brianna. Please go ahead, Brianna.
Thank you so much. So as mentioned, my name is Brianna Miller and my pronouns are she and her. And so I work at the YMCA Centre for Immigrant Programs. And so it is part of the YMCA of Greater Halifax and Dartmouth, but our Immigrant Centre is unique in that it works directly with newcomers to support their settlement here in Nova Scotia. My program is specifically funded by IRCC. So our program works, as mentioned, trying to raise awareness around gender-based violence with newcomers. So understanding what is gender-based violence, what are the supports and services available, what are the laws and your rights, but also working around prevention topics. And I'm going to kind of talk a little bit more about that in a minute. And as was mentioned, we try to raise awareness with people in the community just to better understand experiences of newcomers and how different challenges and barriers that they may experience. No, go back, stay there, sorry. Yeah, so to help us all understand how to be more culturally and religiously sensitive and inclusive and understand how racism, xenophobia, and other forms of discrimination kind of intersect. The other panelists talked more about specific services that people can access around gender-based violence. I know I'm particularly talking about newcomers, but it's really important for us to understand how we can create prevention programming that are specific to needs of different communities. So I hope that you'll take something away from this, and also recognizing that some people may have been a newcomer at some point. You may be in relationships with newcomers, you may work with newcomers, or just in general, it's really important topic for everyone in the community. You can go to the next slide. So I do want to acknowledge that violence happens in all communities. So regardless of your status, your country of origin, your race, your religion, your immigration status, and many other factors, gender-based violence happens in all communities. So I really want to focus on that. However, as Shiva was mentioning, certain populations are at a higher risk of violence. And so we can see that women and girls, Indigenous people from the 2S LGBTQ community, people with disabilities, newcomers, LGBTQ populations, etc., are at a higher risk. And this is because of the structural inequalities that kind of maintain power imbalances and put certain communities at a higher risk, as well as make it more difficult to access supports and services. And so our project particularly focuses on newcomers, not because newcomers are inherently more violent in any way, shape, or form, but because their population, as one of the ones listed, as a higher risk of being victimized by this type of violence. So I just want to acknowledge that. Can move to the next one. So we know that gender-based violence doesn't exist on its own. And so we focus mostly on kind of prevention in this project. And so we recognize that intervention is incredibly important, and that work is needed and more is needed, of course, but we really also recognize that we need to do more work in prevention in all areas. So gender-based violence doesn't exist on its own. There are things that are allowing, contributing, or supporting it to exist in our communities. So if we think of gender-based violence as this big problem in the circle, there are things that are holding it up to kind of support or allow it to exist. They may not directly cause it, but they are things that are kind of normalizing it. So these could be anything from social norms, practices, policies, justice mechanisms, support for victims, jokes, media, lots of different things can support this. So if we think of like policies and workplaces, we could think of like an example could be, what are the supports for victims? Are victims and survivors supported? Are they protected? Do they face any repercussions if they come out? That could potentially be, if they don't have the correct support, that could be a contributing factor for more violence to be happening. Another contributing factor that I know Todd also mentioned was around kind of unhealthy forms of masculinity. So if there's certain pressures and expectations that men experience, these sometimes are unhealthy, and they could result in unhealthy ways of interacting with other men, with partners, with community members, with children. And so that could also be a contributing factor. Shiva also mentioned kind of jokes, these normalizations of jokes and things can kind of create an environment where we think that maybe it's okay or that it's not taken seriously. So sometimes we'll be in places that we'll see awareness campaigns or workshops or things around gender-based violence, but the culture is still joking about it. And so that can kind of still perpetuate gender-based violence. So when we focus on our prevention work, we kind of focus on these contributing factors, and we start to think about if we can focus on lack of awareness of laws, maybe that's a contributing factor, or isolation, or racism, or trauma. These things, that's how we can focus on prevention programming. So you can go to the next slide. So something just to keep in mind is that obviously no two newcomers are the same. Newcomers are very diverse in their experiences of even just immigrating here, as well as like they're coming from many different backgrounds. So these challenges and barriers, not all newcomers will experience, and also this is not all inclusive, but it is some generalized ones to keep in mind. So we need to think about language needs. If someone doesn't have the language, it's going to be harder for them to communicate their needs, to access supports, to connect with the community, to get jobs. This can cause a lot of challenges. Also, the loss of status and income is really, really big. So if someone was a certain position or a title or a job in their home country and then come here and struggle to find work or struggle to make an income to support their family, this can put a lot of pressure on someone and impact their mental health and cause frustration and stress, and particularly on men as well, who typically want to try to provide for their family. So we also know loneliness and isolation is really big. The more isolated people are, the less supports they have if something starts to go wrong. And we know that racism is very prevalent here in Nova Scotia. So again, this is racism within the communities, the school systems, the health providers, and various supports. And when we're thinking about youth and families, one of the big challenges is that families often, the children adapt quicker. So they learn the language, they adapt quicker. So there's often a shifting of family roles. And so what we're noticing is that children are taking on responsibilities that the parents would have done previously, maybe making the bank appointments, advocating for their housing needs, going to the health appointments, translating things for their family. And this shifting of family roles can also cause some extra stress on both sides. The child is now stepping up into roles that are more difficult for them, and the parents suddenly have to rely on their child. So this can also cause some tensions within families. And also the balancing of cultural identities. When people come to Canada, one of the beautiful things is the celebration of diversity. So a lot of families want to hold on to traditions and values as much as they can, but at the same time, their kid might be going into a school environment where there's a lot of peer pressure to conform, to wear the same clothes, to fit in, and it can be really, really hard for a youth trying to navigate the kind of balancing the cultures and the pressures and expectations of them. Rural communities, obviously, newcomers face even additional barriers and challenges. And we must keep in mind too, some newcomers are coming from, particularly if we're thinking of refugees, may have been coming from areas of conflict or war. So they may have also experienced trauma or different types of violence as well throughout the process. So when we're thinking of kind of developing prevention programming, we think about all these challenges and ask ourselves, how could these contribute to gender-based violence? What supports are currently existing to kind of support these things, and how can we begin to address them? Next slide. Something also that we keep in mind is that homophobia, biphobia, and transphobia is gender-based violence. So any forms of these is gender-based violence, whether it's refusing to acknowledge someone's pronouns, not creating accessible spaces, or obviously direct acts of violence. When we're talking about working with newcomers, sometimes people forget that LGBTQ populations exist within the newcomer communities. And we need to be mindful that there are still 77 countries in the world that criminalize same-sex activity. And when we're thinking about that, it's important because with that, there might be stigma, shame, lack of awareness around LGBTQ identities. People may not feel safe to be out, but also trying to access supports and services here as a newcomer who's also LGBTQ is really challenging to find a culturally sensitive or religiously sensitive service, as well as one that's potentially LGBTQ friendly. So, and also, as we know, not just within newcomer communities, homophobia, biphobia, and transphobia affects all LGBTQ populations. And something that's not talked about as much is, yes, the violence against LGBTQ people we need to talk about, but also domestic violence and intimate partner violence within LGBTQ communities. There's less awareness on it, so it's harder for people to identify it and to understand where they should go for supports. Next one. When we're trying to understand kind of unique challenges of newcomers with gender-based violence, there are lots of different barriers to accessing supports and services. So I'm not going to talk about all of them because of time, but I do want you to notice all the different circles, and I will highlight a few. Fear of stigma from their community, this is one. So a lot of people don't want to come forward because if someone's new to the country, their cultural or religious community might be their main support system. So potentially coming forward and accusing someone could result in them being isolated or shamed. And again, they might not want to jeopardize the community reaction if there is one. So it's something to keep in mind. Also mistrust and fear of systems. A lot of newcomers may come from different places or may have negative experiences with government or police or authority figures or organizations. So when they hear of organizations, they might have a mistrust of them or maybe less likely to reach out for help around these things. We also need to keep in mind immigration and status concerns, racism, and as well the concern for their family in a new environment as well. So these are just kind of some of them. Next one. One of the biggest things that our program focuses on with prevention programming is engaging men and boys. So we believe that for a long time when we talk about gender-based violence, men were seen only as the problem. So it was really hard to engage men in prevention work. So we do a lot of work around engaging men and boys because we believe that men need and are part of the solution. We do this in a variety of ways. We offer men's talking groups. We call it Men Talk. And so we have a space where men can be vulnerable, they talk about different topics, and it kind of creates a peer supportive space. So each month we kind of talk about, well, the facilitators talk about a different topic, and they explore some of these prevention themes like masculinity. What are the pressures they face? How does that impact them? How does that impact their families? They might talk about mental health and trauma. Again, what do they have about mental health? What are the stigmas around reaching out for help? How does stress impact them? COVID, financial challenges. We talk about healthy and unhealthy relationships. Where's the line? When does something become abuse and when is it not? So we do talk about kind of like those areas. We really try to engage our young men in like leadership programs through art and photography and videos, and we engage them in a way where they make awareness campaigns. So we have a lot of projects where our newcomer men create awareness campaigns, particularly around masculinities, the topic they're interested in, to teach other men about this subject. So men creating awareness campaigns for other men. So we do a lot of work with men, and I think that that's really important. And like even just yesterday, we had a session on fatherhood and parenting. They talked a lot about how they were parented, how they want to be a father, the impact that has on raising a daughter, on a son, or on anyone, and kind of that relationship around and challenges of parenthood in a new country, navigating cultural differences. Obviously, we do work with women and girls as well. So we do this in similar ways. We offer different workshops for youth, for adult women. And one of the things we try to focus on a lot with women is to try to get away from that myth or stereotype that empowering women or women's rights has to somehow be rejecting culture, tradition, or religion. So we really try to get rid of that assumption and be like, no, your culture, your tradition, your values are empowerment and strong, and let's talk about the strengths. So we really focus on strength-based approaches. And we do focus a lot with the girls around victim blaming and kind of these labels. I know with our newcomer women and girls, one of the things that they talk about is the stigma placed upon women whenever they reach out for help, kind of like, why are you bringing attention to this? Why are you a troublemaker? Why are you kind of causing problems? So we talk about these labels that are placed on women and girls, like troublemaker, drama, things like this, bad girls for the young girls, and how that contributes to victim blaming. And so we do talk about all the other topics, depending on what the women and girls want to talk about, and also do leadership opportunities as well. In general, we don't just do gender specific programming. We do know that that's not always accessible to everyone. However, when it comes with a lot of newcomers, certain topics, some communities are more familiar with gender specific spaces, so we try to offer that. But we also offer programs for everyone. So we do children, youth, and adults programming, as well as families. And we focus on a variety of subjects, again, trying to address those prevention topics around isolation. What is gender-based violence? We did a session around the impacts of COVID-19 and the stress. How do you recognize stress? How does stress impact you? How do you notice when your partner is stressed? And then kind of like leading into topics around abuse and things as well. But we also use this opportunity to connect with organizations, because we recognize that oftentimes we are the first people that newcomers connect with, and they may mistrust other organizations. So we try to bring in other organizations to do workshops as well. For example, I think they might actually be here today, but Alice House partnered once with us to deliver a trauma-informed parenting workshop, recognizing that settlement and just moving could be traumatic for children. And there's a lot of our children may be experiencing trauma, and that may result in behavior challenges and needs. And so parents need support around like how to parent and support their children through this as well. So we partner with organizations that are experts sometimes in these things, and that also helps connect newcomers to other organizations. These are kind of just some examples. Yeah. And I just want to kind of like end with that prevention of gender-based violence is everyone's responsibility. So we need to continue to speak out against gender-based violence and raise awareness about the prevalence of it, the issues, what is it. We also need to challenge social norms, policies, and systems that perpetuate forms of oppression that contribute to gender-based violence. We need to be aware and inclusive of the unique needs and challenges of those most at risk. So while I'm talking specifically about newcomers, as I mentioned, there's other groups, LGBTQ, Indigenous, women and girls, people with disabilities, and many other groups that are high risk. So we need to think, how are we supporting them with intervention? And how are we focusing our prevention to address their unique needs and challenges? So kind of just want to put that out there. And we also need to challenge sexism, racism, homophobia, transphobia, xenophobia, and all the other forms of discrimination, which we know that are connected to gender-based violence. And obviously continue to support our victims and survivors. And so just want to thank everyone. So again, I know this was very, very quick. I do work at the YMCA Centre for Immigrant Programs. We are the Gender-Based Violence Prevention Project, but I do want to acknowledge we do have mobile crisis workers who do the one-on-one support for people experiencing intimate partner or domestic violence or any other crisis to help navigate them one-on-one through different systems. But if people want to learn more about our programs, or they want to take a training, like a more in-depth training, we do offer free trainings for people to join. Anyone can join them, or a group can get one individually. So thank you so much for your time, and I hope that you took something away from it.
Thanks, Brianna. Thanks so much for explaining the important work that you do, educating professionals and newcomers about the issue of gender-based violence.
Now we invite you all to our virtual panel discussion with our three presenters. This discussion will be 20 to 25 minutes. The panelists will be asked a few questions that address the issue of gender-based violence to generate discussion. This panel will be moderated by my social